There are multiple ways to keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast. Through our Instagram handle, the Wolf Connection Pod, and for comments and questions, send us an email to podcast@wolfconnection.org with your comments, questions, and guest ideas for Stephen and myself. You may hear your question answered on an upcoming podcast. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Calfa. Let's talk about some wolves. So Stephen and I are very excited because this is our first, not our first author, but really a good partnership for the podcast to partner with this specific author, this specific book, and with Macmillan Publishing and really going forward with a good thing for the next couple of podcasts. You guys are going to be hearing sponsorship from these guys. But she's been a winner of the Steinberg Essay Prize, an AWP Journals Award. This is her first book, not her first publication, but it just released 2 weeks ago, February 21st in 2023. It's called Wolfish, Wolf, Self, and the Stories We Tell About Fear. She is Erica Berry. Erica, it's awesome to see you and meet you finally. How's everything going on your tour so far?
Thanks so much for having me. All is well. Hello from Brooklyn right now. I've been in so many different time zones. I don't know what time of day it is, but I'm here and I'm thrilled to be chatting.
Yeah, no, I bet you there's just a lot going on. It's a huge whirlwind. I guess the first question right off the bat for me is, what's it like now that the book is finally done? It's out there for everyone to listen to and read. What's the level for you where you're at right now as a first time author of a book like this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something that's very gratifying about getting to sort of see the ways it resounds and ripples. And this is a book that pulls in, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Little Red Riding Hood, but also real life OR7 and werewolves and feminism and history of Oregon's founding. It's got all these different sides. And I think that kind of prismatic quality is kind of interesting because different things will grab different people. And so it's always interesting to sort of see what is coming through the woodwork when somebody reaches out, and that's lovely. So there's a degree of self-exposure where you have this thing living inside you, and then suddenly it's out there. And this book is intimate in my own head, and so I'm still wrestling with that a little bit. People know things about me that, of course, I had a lot of control over saying, but also, it's there's something there, especially writing about fear. It's in the subtitle. This is sort of thinking about my relationship with that emotion. And so, there's a little bit of a learning curve getting used to having it all out there.
Well, speaking of fear, is it scarier to write a book or release it and be in waiting to see what it manifests?
That's a good question. I think this is a French idiom that was, if you talk about the wolf, you see its tail. And that idea that, we sort of conjure, the thing that is conjured is sometimes scarier than the thing itself. And I think very often the wolf in folklore is the specter. And for me, I'm not afraid of real wolves, but I think I became afraid of the book, the publication, in a way that was very spectral and sort of like I was fantasizing something. And now that I'm actually face to face with it, you're like, okay, we're just standing here in front of, like, there's a book, there's a person, here we are. And I think that's less fantastical than I was imagining.
Yeah, because you weave this so wonderfully. It's tough to describe, and not in a bad way, because you really mix this history, myth, biological, personal stories all into these chapters. And you bounce so well back and forth between, you're talking about some mythology about werewolves, and then you tie it back into OR7's journey, and then you move into a personal story. And it really flows quite nicely for something like that, just listening to it as an audiobook. So it flows beautifully. I know you, as a young adult and a kid, you loved wolves from the get-go, it seemed. What was that like to draw that type of inspiration from your younger self when you're putting these words down on the page?
Yeah, I think I learned at some point that the root of the word amateur is lover in Latin or Greek or something like that. And I like that idea that even when you're a kid, I didn't know very much about wolves. I didn't know half as much as I knew now, but you just feel that sense of love for a thing. And I think I had a dog as a kid, and just remember really feelings of like sitting with her and staring into her eyes And you just spend so long trying to figure out, what are they thinking? How are they making me think? Like, there's a real intimacy, and you kind of live in that moment where you feel like you're on a bridge together or something, and you're building a bridge. And so I think that sort of very elemental feeling of childhood connection with an animal does become sort of an engine for curiosity later. And I think wolves, as a kid, I didn't see wolves in the wild. I sort of thought I did, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But I knew they were there eventually, and I think I always thought they were sort of magical. And that distance between actually like knowing what it would be like to interact with a wolf, but sort of hearing them, I was kind of interested in that distance. There was a lack of intimacy, unlike, say, with my dog, that was really provocative and kind of compelling. And I think that mystery around wolves does, I think, explain some of the kind of psychic power that they have held on for us for a long time.
It's hard to ask this question very specifically, so my apologies up front, but I'm still curious. What kind of came first? I mean, it seems like it would be a stretch to assume you just decided in one instant to to weave this narrative about your own life experiences, the worldview of fear and animals, the history of Portland, feminism, wolves, simultaneously, and then also kind of rope it all into this concept of fear, which is already a very complex topic to write about and to understand. So, I mean, what came first? What was the initial inspiration that led to this extraordinarily complex weaving of many stories all at once?
Totally. No, that was actually well said for what a like sprawling mess of a book it is. I think now I realize that my fascination in real and symbolic wolves happened somewhat simultaneously. And I was a college student studying environmental studies in Maine, had to pick a thesis topic to research. And I was trying to think what could hold my fascination for a year. And I heard that wolves were repopulating Oregon, and it was causing all this controversy. And I do think I had kind of a family question, because I have a relative who had some anti-wolf bumper stickers on his truck. And I'm sure you've seen the type, wolves. I'm forgetting which ones they were. There's wolves smoke a pack a day, wolves government-sponsored terrorism, all that. Yeah. And I did not understand the rhetoric, I guess, to put it bluntly. I felt like that was not about wolves. That was about something else. And
political statement.
Exactly. So I became kind of interested in like looking at the rhetoric around reintroduction or repopulation in Oregon pretty academically. And I thought, I'm just going to go in and do some research. And I was talking to folks, and I'm from Portland, but have family that live rurally, and was visiting people around and was doing this academic project. And then a couple things happened. One thing was my mom got really sick one summer, and she had a really high fever, and she was actually hospitalized, and we didn't know what was causing it. And at some point, the doctors figured out that it was a tick-related illness, and that they sort of said in the offhand way, doctors sometimes say like, oh, well, if we had more wolves, the ecosystem would be more balanced, and there would be fewer rodents and deer spreading these tick-related things. And it wasn't really like a scientific textbook statement. It was an offhand comment, but it made me realize that my body and the wolf and my mother, like we were all tied in the same ecosystem in a way that previously I think I thought about wolves as like, that would be really cool to see one over on that hill. But I wasn't really thinking about the interconnectivity of what it meant to share the habitat. And so that was a real moment for me where I thought, I was thinking about being worried for my loved ones or something, and the wolf was there, and it was totally not the way the wolf is usually talked about, right? It was actually maybe bringing wolves back would kind of help these things. And then I guess the last part of the question was that I began around this time that I just happened to be studying wolves sort of academically, journalistically. I was dealing with fear in my own life, and I was living alone in cities for the first time to some degree, and just having a couple experiences with essentially mostly strange men who I didn't know, that were making me really question the narratives that I'd been taught about fear and sort of what is the value of fear. And I realized at some point, like a lot of those stories had wolves in them, or those idioms had wolves. People were saying things like, well, don't get murdered when you go off to the cabin. And I'm like, I love hiking. I love camping. Like, I don't want to think about getting murdered. Oh, wait, like that's the Little Red Riding Hood kind of story. And I was kind of resistant to tying those two things together, because I thought like the goal is to separate them. But I realized, sometimes if anyone who's written, sometimes it's like your pen just kind of steers a certain way. And as much as I wanted to write about wolves just sort of scientifically or historically, I felt like the symbolism was something I was grappling with in my own life. And so I was kind of drawn that way, trying to answer these questions for myself, both kind of why do people that I know or in my community hate wolves? I was trying to answer that. And also this idea of the symbolic wolf, what does that mean? And how does that maybe inform my own struggle to live beside things that scare me?
I mean, when you're talking about these personal, because I was telling you before we started, I'm roughly 3/4 of the way through. And a lot of these personal, I think I just passed this personal part where you were talking about this, about relatives of yours that posing with rifles and they had anti-wolf bumper stickers and things like that. But your grandfather had a sheep farm when you were growing up, and that seemed to really stick with you too. How did you really try to balance this? Because you do speak of your grandfather highly and the positivity of working the land and being a farmer and being in those rural areas. So how did you really try to balance this? Or was there really a push-pull for you in your mind as you were getting to put these words on the page about how you perceived what wolves were being thought as and what you actually were finding out through all this research and through the work that you were doing?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. It was one I was thinking about sensitively, as anyone who's written about their family is aware of those questions. I will say that right from the get-go, I inherited a sense that it wasn't, at least in my family, there wasn't the same sort of like urban versus rural, environmentalist versus producer. Those were sort of the media depictions of the wolf issue. And yet what I saw in my family was that my grandfather, who had the sheep farm and was trapping coyotes, at least with wire traps that to me were like not a humane thing, but he was also a big conservationist and was going on these big trips and sending money and supporting wild creatures. So there was always, he was holding those two things in his head. And part of me was trying to figure out how that was possible, but also some of my relatives in Montana that were, hunters, but also really big advocates for wilderness areas or protection. And so I was trying to confront those sort of paradoxes a little bit for myself. And also it occurred to me at one point that when I said I was writing an environmental studies thesis, people were telling me, well, don't go you can't tell the ranchers you're doing that. And I thought, well, forget, I'm going to tell them who I am. And I'm also going to say my grandpa has a sheep farm and just hope that people can like meet me in the complexity and I will meet them in the complexity. And I think the wolf issue it's such a polarized issue. It's been made a polarized issue when in reality, often like there is a common ground, I think sometimes, which is that like, people care about the land. I'm not saying that's true for everyone, but I went into this project thinking, well, I want to be able to sit down with you and hear your story, and I want you to feel heard. And also I'm going to bring a certain complexity to this and history and hope that we can meet each other there. And I had a bit of a good faith. I certainly got yelled at. There were people that didn't want to talk to me. It wasn't all that smooth. I don't mean to sound naive about it, but I did want to, I thought my family history gave me a sense of like, I could kind of see how different sides were seeing the issue. And I thought that it was important. I think, producers trying to live with wolves, if I was just going to say that like, I'm trying to think how to word it because it's so sensitive, but I would rather a producer be struggling and talking about how to live with wolves than just shoot, shovel, and shut up, right? And so I wanted to open a space for conversation, even if those conversations were hard, rather than be too unapproachable.
Because I remember there was a part, again, I think I just passed this portion of the book where I think you just went back to Oregon and you were in a bar or a dive somewhere, and you were talking about this thesis, I think, with your friend, and you were talking with an individual. Essentially, and you equated, I think, to Beauty and the Beast a little bit, but at least that's what I picture in my head, where he sort of slammed his mug down and was essentially saying you can't talk about wolves in this area to a degree. It was essentially that, and it was one of those like everybody looks at you moments where the music stops, it screeches to a halt, and everybody goes, "What is this person talking about?" How many of those, I guess, in your experience in getting through this, was it roughly 50-50, or do you think it swayed one way or the other? Because it really does seem fairly balanced in the book itself, that there's pro and there's wiggle room there, and that there's on the other side, and I hate saying anti-wolf, just not pro-wolf, and there's wiggle room there too. Did you find yourself being a conduit in a way to get to those stories like you were just saying, or were you met sort of with either pro or anti
Yeah.
in those conversations.
I mean, that was an interesting example because his response was just like, there's only one solution. You don't even need to talk about it. It's just, we just have to shoot them all. And he sort of mimed shooting up the bar. And I thought that's so the opposite of the sort of complexity I'm going towards. This is really interesting that this happened. But I will say, when I was looking for, say, producers to interview, I wanted to talk to people livestock producers, that is, who were trying to make a real effort to live beside the wolves. And I think I wanted to show readers that there is a way for these shared lands to function, and the people have been doing that for hundreds of years. And there's ways that you can manage a herd, and that's a challenge. But there were people that were, that takes a little bit. A couple of ranchers said, I'd love to talk to you, but if I go on the record talking to someone writing a book about wolves, my neighbors won't have anything to do with me. I can't. And that was frustrating. There's a lot of, talk to a lot of people, you build a relationship, and they're just too scared. And I think that speaks to the real vitriol on this sort of, as you say, anti-wolf contingent side, where the wolf is much bigger than the wolf. And there was just a total resistance to getting involved with my project to some of that.
What can you define as something that really surprised you while talking to producers?
I think one woman, April Martin Chalfant, who I talked to, and she's Indigenous, and she inherited a tradition of the wolf as a real protector, and she brought me stories and folklore about that, and she really believes that wolves have a place in the ecosystem and have helped her people, and she's also a rancher, and so she was sort of talking about grappling with the fact of she runs a woman-run, Indigenous operation, and she's also trying to think about, if wolves are coming back into her part of southeastern Montana, how they'll manage. And I thought that was like a kind of an interesting conflation of the complexity. I would say a couple producers I talked to, one had hired someone whose job was essentially to sort of range ride, but also to track. He was really a tracker, and he was like, okay, we're getting like scents of wolf, we're seeing them, and we're going to move the herds really intuitively, and that's a lot of work and labor for them, but that was really working. And they were able to point to that as an example. And I felt like, there were people that would say, I'm really frustrated that I've lost this many cows or this many dogs to wolves, but also this wolf is pretty cool. And after we'd talk, sometimes they'd like text me and say, there's a signal, the wolf is nearby. I thought you'd be curious. And I thought that was interesting too. Like, there actually was a fascination for this animal and an understanding. And it wasn't just totally repelled. It was like I'm trying to hold these two things together. And, sometimes people would be kind of reticent to admit it, but my wire electric fence is actually working, and the wolves maybe aren't as big of a problem. And, this was really bad 3 years ago. But I think that was one of the benefits of reporting this project, having conversations over close to a decade. I was in college 2013, 2014 when I was working on this. And so, I could check back with people and say, you were really fired up about this. How's it going now? They're like, oh, we've learned. And I thought that was really hopeful, because there's in some states where wolves are just coming back, there's so much fear. And I'm like, that was Oregon in 2015. And now, there's somebody said the new wolf is the face mask right now. Like, the sense of the wolf as the big drama that moves to some degree. So I thought that
interesting.
was helpful. Yeah. And I think, understanding that other things are threatening their livelihood more than the wolf, I think was important. And so they often just want to talk, there's a degree of well, let me talk about the other ways ranching is hard. And I thought that is important, and also important to show city folks maybe that one of the threats to wolves is also habitat for prey being broken up with suburban sprawl. Conservationists that I talked to would say, we've got to, we can't just protect the wolf, we got to protect the habitat for the wolf. And one story that Arthur Middleton, a biologist, told me was someone near him who would poach wolves sometimes, I think that was the accurate word to use, was also buying up a bunch of land to protect it and prevent it from being turned into ranchettes, basically. And he said that guy was doing more for the wolves. This guy is studying wolves, and he's mad that this rancher is killing his collared wolves. At the same time, this rancher is protecting all this land. And he was like, that's the complexity. Right. And so I didn't want to come down on, I think that wolves deserve to live in the wilderness. And also, I think it's not just poaching that is a problem for them living. I think, it's other parts of human society as well.
Habitat.
Yeah, it's such a complex thing that you tied in here. And really, it goes back to fear. And that actually, I want to touch on that because you said it so wonderfully there about the communities, the producing communities, is that fear was there. How did you see those things shift, or if they shifted at all? Because your story is starting to shift. I'm starting to see, like I said, as I get further along, that you're starting to question yourself about the fear in your own personal journey, about were these things that I was really seeing, were the things that I was really saying? And did you see any of those shifts over time? Because as you said, this is a labor of almost a decade of doing this book and doing all this research and weaving these stories in. Did anything start to shift that you were seeing over the course of time? Or how did fear really play into this? Was it really rooted in a lot of this migration that happened, Oregon Trail, stuff coming over from Europe, or was there something different that was sort of laid in there for them?
Mm-hmm. With sort of like narratives around the wolf.
Yeah.
Here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because I think on one level, I grew up in the 90s, 2000s, like the wolf was not a figure of fear. We kind of think, oh, we're past that. Everyone knows they're conserving it. And yet just the other day, a friend told me, have you seen this new show, Yellow Jackets on Showtime or something? It's a TV show. Yeah. And there's apparently these like scary wolves in it, quote unquote. And I haven't watched the show, but she said her husband had actually had like a nightmare about the wolves in the show. And I'm like, really? We're still having like nightmares about wolves? So I think it's kind of interesting where the wolf became a figurehead of maybe environmental restoration in certain ways. After the 70s, you have this amazing writing about wolves. And then in some ways, though, there's still the big bad wolf. It's definitely still there. And, there was so much kind of in the Western biblical tradition of the wolf as opposition. I think like studying early colonial history in the States, like people were draining the swamps because the swamps were said to shelter wolves and vermin. That's a quote. And so you're thinking about a whole ecosystem is totally changed because of this sort of like, we got to get rid of the wolf. And there was a quote from a Oregon historian saying like extending the bounds of civilized space, again, kind of quote unquote, like killing the wolf was a way to do that. And you see these sort of bounties on wolves was the first law in Oregon. And I think understanding the way that hating the wolf, or rather fighting the wolf or creating the wolf as a kind of scapegoat for other fears is really tied into early stories of American history and founding. And so it became like to look at that myth is to really look at how America has thought about fear or the other more broadly outside of the wolf itself, because the language is just there.
It's interesting because these stories have come from our ancestors in Europe, most of us anyway, in that you say Little Red Riding Hood, Big Bad Wolf, Boy Who Cried Wolf, all of those stories about, and it really ties back into human society when you were talking about, oh, Boy Who Cried Wolf. And so we say those things in relation to, oh, this person is exaggerating or lying. And when it comes over here and you're talking about people moving westward, you have them, as you just said, civilized space. In other words, that wolves are classified as lesser than. And you made a correlation too, which I found fascinating, that they were starting to treat wolves when they came back or when they moved back and forth across the Canadian border almost as an immigration status.
Yep.
In that they didn't belong here, even though they were native to this land well before we were here. Mm-hmm. Where did those stories come from? I guess especially here. It's surprising to me that we made this shift as a culture in the 70s to start to conserve after having over 100 years of just sort of plowing through it and making sure that we as a species can survive and expand and create the culture that we have today. And then all of a sudden we make this seismic shift of, no, we need to protect everything. So where did this all come from? And why did these stories impact everyone so much? And why did you think when writing this that nobody looked just a little bit deeper as to where those stories came from? Because like you say, there was some biblical arcs in there too. I know that's a long rambling
No,
statement, but
it's such a fascinating thing, and I think the sort of xenophobia about wolves from both Canada and Mexico. I found examples where they're like, "This is invaded territory. We're going to be infested. We have to patrol the border." And you look at even people now that are sort of revered as Teddy Roosevelt, a father of conservation, is sort of seen popularly, but referred to wolves as black-hearted criminals. And I think that sense of the wolf as being a threat to sort of these early settler communities. And, when Yellowstone and Glacier were formed, the park warden they were patrolling the borders of the park to chase wolves out, as well as the native peoples that were there, the Blackfeet, I believe it was. And so there was a degree of trying to control who could hunt on this land. And I think very often in America, controlling animals is a way of controlling the people as well. And that was one thing that I don't think I understood going into the project, how much rhetoric around controlling the wolf. There were times in, I believe it was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where there was basically like indigenous peoples had to bring in a wolf head in order to get grain and wine. And that was not just a way of killing the wolves, but of undermining these sacred beliefs that they carried about the wolf. So the ways that the power was there, was really big. And I believe, thinking about what happened when wolves were reintroduced in the Rockies and Yellowstone, there was a degree of sort of Canada now has this thing that we want. Like, it was competition ultimately, which is kind of funny that that was how one historian I read, I thought it was a quite compelling take, described it as like Oregon or America rather, seeing like, well, maybe we could have wolves. Maybe that would be a tourist thing. And suddenly we want them back, even though previously we've been like patrolling our borders from them. And so again, even that becomes a bit of a power play move, like that's how humans, and I want to, of course, there was a degree of wanting to reintroduce for other reasons that were more ecologically sound. But I do think that relationship, it's been tied to these larger than life ideas for so long.
For you, when did you start? Did you parallel your personal journey at any point to OR7? Because you keep going back to that, about his trek back and forth and what he must be feeling or thinking. And I know we've talked about this a couple of times on the podcast with other scientists and biologists about I can't say the word. Anyway, putting feeling on. Thank you, Stephen. But just to say that we're putting these feelings on these animals and however they feel. But did you, as you're putting this stuff together and realizing your personal journey shifting, at what point did you think you started correlating that with OR7, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question of anthropomorphizing sort of was like the umbrella over this book, because I didn't ever want to make OR7. I think one review sort of said, sometimes OR7 is this metaphor for you. And I thought, well, I don't want him to be a metaphor. He's a real wolf, and I want people to understand his life. And at the same time, I think there's a very human instinct where we look at the natural world, say, and we sort of are trying to understand ourselves through it. And I didn't think that was actually inherently a problem. I mean, me looking at OR7 left dispersed from his pack in Oregon. He was a seventh wolf collared in Oregon and left from his pack in northeastern Oregon in 2011. And I graduated from college in 2010 and flew away from my family to the East Coast, where I had no family. So by the time I heard about OR7 and he started collecting sort of international headlines, Newsweek at one point said he was the most famous wolf in the world. And that was when I started paying attention to him. It was because he was away from family and looking for a mate, essentially. And this idea of like a wolf goes off alone, quite common. This is one of the reasons why wolf territories are so big, because it was dispersing. And he was looking for good territory, and there were no other known wolves at that time. And so people were really, there was a level of anthropomorphizing that made me uncomfortable. It was like, he's looking for love. He's heartsick. He's in the wrong place. It's like, he's just doing what wolves do, and he doesn't know there's another wolf there. And so I think my first fascination with OR7 was actually, I was watching the people that were watching him, and I was slightly uncomfortable with what felt like people were making it a rom-com, and they were projecting their own selves, their own loneliness on this wolf. And I felt uncomfortable with that. And at the same time, I also was like away and gone and sort of trying to figure out my own way. And so sometimes you don't want to create a symbolic conflation, but you're like, well, I am sort of invested in this. And there's something maybe beautiful about watching that. But I would go in these Facebook groups dedicated to OR7 or on the Twitter accounts, and I would just be like, I'm just here because I'm looking at the other people who are obsessed. And of course, a part of me was invested too. And I think in the book, I sort of watched the trajectory. OR7 eventually does find a mate and does start a pack, and that pack becomes intertwined in ways with the land around it, which is to say, suddenly having some run-ins with ranchers. And I met some of the ranchers who had lost cattle to OR7's pack. And that complexity was kind of intriguing to me, as I felt my life had also, it gets more complex. It's not just a story of leaving home. It's also, so I think I began to see like, maybe I can tell this story of one wolf that will help people understand to some degree what it's like to be a wolf out there. Like I can look closely at OR7's life because he had a collar, but also with my life, one interview sort of said, you put a collar around yourself and you're sort of looking at these small moments in your life. Kind of that idea, like OR7, other wolves that have wandered as far as OR7. There's other people who have dealt with fear just like me, but we're both just like two members of our species. And maybe by telling this story really closely, you can kind of understand each one. I mean, maybe in some ways I'm a metaphor for OR7 as much as he's a metaphor for me. Like we're both just two animals who are trying to figure out or who had an adventure after leaving home, I guess.
So, I mean, more directly, why do you, I'm just curious, why do you think it made you uncomfortable to humanize OR7? Did it make you uncomfortable as a writer, or does it generally make you uncomfortable when animals are anthropomorphized?
I think I did have a squeamishness that now I would question. Now I am more comfortable with anthropomorphizing because I think that the opposite, to presume that an animal doesn't have human emotions, like, can't you say that this human is having animal emotions right now? Like, right. What is that? I think that really furthers this sense of like humans and non-humans. And I don't know what it was. I think it was a sort of science class. I was worried about being a serious, I thought it would make me not be taken seriously or something. And I felt like there was a divide between the science and capital S kind of way. But at the same time, like I was a poet as a teenager, like I was always trying to come to the science with a sense of feeling. We have to feel things. And as a storyteller, the stories I'd fallen in love with that had made me care about animals were very often showing that animal having some of the same emotions that I had as a human. I mean, I think you see this with like parent-child animal stories. And I remember reading that a researcher in the 90s found evidence of wolves burying their dead wolf pups. What is that, right? Can you call that grief? But I was really interested in those stories, and like, surely we have to be able to like write into these really emotional animal experiences. And so I'm a lot less squeamish now.
What do you consider again, the not anti-wolf people, but the countering group? What do you consider what the countering groups are doing when they perceive wolves? Are they anthropomorphizing them in a way that just yields a completely different result, or is it something else? It's making me question this now because, as people who are, we support the idea of reintroducing wolves. We sometimes can anthropomorphize them. It's just part of the thing that happens. Are the countering groups doing the same thing kind of? It's just yielding a different result.
I think, yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think there is a degree of like vilifying the wolf, making it into a human, calling a wolf a terrorist, right? Like
exactly.
That is so harmful. And I think part of this goes back to learning the science about wolves a little bit more. Like when I learned that wolves are really born afraid, and like was reading about wolves on the set of Dracula, the film, or no, was it the company of wolves? What's that movie? They were afraid of a duck while they were filming. And like those kind of anecdotes like create a much more richly textured wolf than the idea of that sort of like straw man that you hear about in the evil. And so I did feel like one of the first things that made me fired up about this project was thinking like people are referring to wolves in ways that are really harmful to wolves, but also people are being animalized as wolves. Immigrants are
That's a
being
great
called a
point.
wolf pack, refugees. Those that there's a feedback loop there where the animalizing of people and the vilification of wolves is actually hurting both sides. And I think, I sort of thought, well, normally you've got to just write about the wolves, you've got to write about the people. And I'm like, this is connected. These are not separate issues.
Why do you think, in all of your research and all these folks you're talking to, why do you think that we are all anthropomorphizing this particular species? Like, I don't really see it happening with elk, for example. Like, why wolves? Or maybe it's just predators. I don't know.
Yeah, no, but I mean, someone recently in a Q&A was like, can you tell me any folk tales about mountain lions? I was like, oh, no, I can't,
true, yeah.
Like,
I mean, yeah, I guess not, right?
somebody else said, will you write your next book about bears? And I was like, I could, but it's a totally different species. Like the wolf occupies such a specific place in our psyche. And I think so much of that is the parallels between us. And I think, at one point I was really trying to get inside the head of a person who really hates the wolf. I could not figure it out, right? And I thought, when have I ever hated someone this much? And I couldn't think of anything except like being a teenage girl in a feud once a long time ago. And I was trying to think about like what made those kind of teen nemesis behavior. And it was that we shared a lot in common, right? It was the girl who I'd once been really good friends with. And then we had too much in common and something happened. And that actually got me thinking more about this animosity. And I think, both wolves and humans are collaborative hunters. They raise their young together. You have aunties and big siblings helping to feed a young wolf. And you have, they even will pass down territory through generations. They'll mate monogamously. Like there's all of these things that allow that projection. And I think this is where this kind of stickiness of people saying, is that becoming a metaphor? It's like, sometimes you just have a wolf mating for life and you have two people that are in love, and like, one's not a metaphor for the other. They're just both doing these things. And I think it was, I'm interested in how that overlap becomes kind of weaponized to then say like, this is what's going on. And one other statistic that comes to mind was the most dangerous species to a wolf is another wolf statistically. Sure, and the most dangerous one to a human is another human. And like we're not in some battle with wolves. This was the other thing, is I think so many, the way you look at how wolves are framed and you think like, we're these like two creatures out to get each other on the plains. That's how the predators and some of these early maybe colonial narratives were framed. And really the wolf just could care less. And so it's a real there's this unequality that I was like, this is kind of embarrassing for humans. We really think wolves are out to get us. They're not at all. Right. And so, yeah.
Wow.
Did you at any point start to view the world through wolves' eyes as you were going through this project, and starting to see that as you were going through this project?
I love that question, because I do think learning about how the wolf would hear something, say, or smell something better, I think part of it is becoming more aware that I was seeing the world through human eyes, and that wasn't how the world looked. Right, that a wolf would be aware of different things. And Ed Yong's book, which now I'm blanking on the name, he talks so much about how different species see things and like visualize threat. And I think understanding what a wolf can smell the sex, that whether of an animal that has recently passed, of another wolf, they can know when it last fed, like that level of knowledge, I think really chipped away at some of these very human-centric views of like humans are the smart creatures. We have, that dangerous binary of like, there's humans and there's all the other animals. And when you start to learn more about the knowledge that a wolf can pass on, or to be able to read the landscape, I think it does sort of challenge that speciesism. And that was really interesting to me, because I didn't have a sort of scientific background in that. And I think growing up, I did sometimes feel like a connection with coyotes or foxes. I would often have these run-ins with them. And the wolf wasn't as accessible to me. I wasn't seeing them in my neighborhood. And that's part of what was interesting, and maybe part of why I feel like I can't get behind the wolf's eyes. And as a writer, I was interested in like, how close can I get? And also I want to make readers aware that I can't fully be there. And what is that sort of mystery or that distance that's kind of sacred to, and important.
I'm curious. I'm always curious about writing books. It seems like an impossible thing to do. Just in my mind, when you write a book, is the primary moment of epiphany happening before the book is written, and then the journey of writing it begins, or do you feel like through the writing of it is where the real learning occurs? For example, what did you learn about your own fear through the writing of the book? Now that you're on the other side of this, how has your relationship with your own personal experience with fear changed?
Yeah, I mean, first off, writing a book is an impossible project. I don't recommend it to anyone. I don't know that I will ever do it again. No, you do it because you feel like you have to. I
Yeah,
think
you
that,
can't not do it.
yeah, unfortunately. I mean, at one point, a therapist told me, you can't, you're writing about fear is fixating on it, and I think you should stop.
Sure.
And I just felt like that was wrong. And, there's this whole history of, writing into trauma is helpful and coping with it. I feel like you guys know this is like part of what you're all doing there. And I think recognizing that understanding fear as a story that had been sold to me that was benefiting someone, that idea of, to go back to Little Red Riding Hood, like she's going to stay on the path. Why is she on the path? Because she's told there's a wolf out there. And I'm someone that's like, loves to go hike alone, do anything. It's like, I don't want to be told I can't do anything. And so but the creation of a threat, and again, like Hegel, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but had the quote that's like, if we don't fear death, we don't need the state as like laws. And so, that creation of a threat is sort of a civic, it's an inherited thing. And I think I began to think about certain narratives that I'd been told, maybe that had, as a young woman going out and walking, and like, was that actually rational to feel afraid? Or when was that? And I'm a less hypervigilant person now than I was at the beginning of this book. And I think to some degree, like understanding the statistics and understanding those narratives, I would really encourage everyone who feels a specific fear. Sometimes fear is a lack of knowledge. And if there's a period where I was very afraid of flying on airplanes, and I just couldn't accept it. And I really had to confront, like, that's because I really love my work right now and I don't want to die. I love my family, or I love my friends.
Exactly.
And it's just,
Right.
I don't want to die. I don't want to leave them. And once I could like admit that actually the opposite of fear is about love, and like I wanted to lean into the things I loved, it became easier to live beside it. So, any phobia out there, my big phobia is not wolves, it's snakes. It's always just, I'm just like a jumpy person about that. And that gets me when I'm hiking. But like now I feel like my reaction would be like, okay, what's the act, like go deep into that story. And also, when have I heard snakes are bad? Oh, ever since Garden of Eden, like even
Right.
that is a story sold to me. And I think that is a really useful mechanism that, so often we're talked about, like, how do we grow out of our fears? But I was really interested in how we grow into them, and in like actually encouraging people to really like question that and not just like carry it around.
Wow. Which of the personal experiences that you label in the book impacted you, looking back now, probably the most, in terms of the effect it had on you in the moment, and also what you learned from it afterwards, and that you're able to hopefully help the next person who reads this book and might have a similar experience?
I mean, first, I think one thing was that I did, at first I sort of thought, I'm not going to put my personal experiences in here. And then somebody said, well, like, your personal experiences are a form of authority that help you understand fear in the same way that like talking to a biologist who studies fear responses in animals will. And I think, as a reporter who was reporting some of this as a young woman, I would go out, and I had an experience on the train where someone became, I guess, sort of, he sat down next to me and was unstable and had some addiction issues, and ended up writing me letters that were threatening and totally sort of fixated in a stalkery way. And I thought, like, I don't even want to focus on this. I just want to like read my book about wolves and go take the train to my research and try understanding that those stories were tied up, that I couldn't quite just research the wolf without that. My experiences of doing that were impacted. And I think that was an interesting example because it was one of the times where I was most afraid in my life in some ways because it stretched out. You know, when you're on a train, you're in an enclosed space, you can't just leave. So I would try to leave the guy, he would come and find me. And there was a drama to that. It was almost like, you know, a play or something. And I was really worried about that he was just not well. And I don't actually know if I was really right, if it was fair of me to feel afraid. And, you know, what ended up happening was the police entered the train and removed the man. And there was a sense of things were maybe worse than I'd known about some of the drugs he had. That was, I think, the right choice for the safety of the train. But afterwards, I was really thinking like, well, what now? Like, this idea of there's a scary thing and we're just going to remove it, that doesn't really solve it. You know, like I felt better, maybe my body felt better on the train, but I was thinking we dropped him off in the middle of eastern Montana and the train just kept going. And I'm like, what happens to him now? Like, where is he? And am I going to see him again? Or what is happening? Like, I felt a curiosity about him that I think that the sort of, you know, early Little Red Riding Hood stories, it's just like either the girl dies or the wolf dies. That's just how they end. And I became very much frustrated by the idea that like there's just this binary and there's going to be a victor and a villain. And I don't, in so many experiences of fear in my own life, there's much more complexity. Like this guy wasn't a villain. I don't know, you know, we had this interaction that was upsetting, but I didn't know what to do with it. And so I think that was an experience I play it out in the book, and it was definitely really affected me, but also was sort of unresolved. And I think that sense of unresolved is maybe important to think about, even though it's kind of unsatisfying.
I mean, how did you explore human fear in preparation for the writing of this book? I mean, what did the exploration of that look like to get to a point where you feel confident about writing about human fear in a broad sense, not specifically your experiences with fear, but were there certain texts involved, or how did you explore that topic?
I mean, one thing was like talking to a biologist who studies ecology of fear in landscapes, but she applies human context of PTSD to animals. And it was fascinating because she's telling me like, Erica, a plant, an animal, or a human, you experience something scary, you're a different creature the next day. Like your body changes, you have these fear responses. And it was useful to just like think of myself as an animal, I think, and understand that what does fear do to an animal? It's going to make that animal less hungry, less wanting to think about having kids, less like all of those things suddenly were sort of like ramifying in my own life. And so I think, again, like thinking about fear, even in wolves, like I was reading another biologist talking about how wolves, when they're afraid, it's not actually that their world gets smaller. Sometimes fear is a form of curiosity making, and you hear something in the tree and you're like, I'm going to go investigate. And that became an interesting, again, I don't think that was a metaphor for my own experience, but I would think about, oh yeah, when can fear kind of open a door? And so I would say that like, I would talk to some of these scientists and I would say, listen, you study this in animals. You're probably not going to be comfortable to me talking about your own experience. Can you extrapolate to humans? And they'd be like, well, I'm not supposed to, but actually, yeah. And then they would. And I just think like, we are all animals. And this kind of sense that like human fear and animal fear are totally different. Yeah, there's something there. But I do think that the narratives around fear, I just like read a lot of both memoirs of people that were really anxious and how it had been written about. I sort of thought, I can't write about fear. So many people have written about it, but I think grounding it in my own experiences, hopefully give a sense for the reader, even if they have a really different experience than mine, from sort of contrasting and saying, oh, this is what I would have done in that situation. And I wanted to give the reader space to hopefully have their own journey while they're reading it.
Yeah, because when you're melding all of these personal experiences, these interviews, these stories together, how did you come out the other side? I don't know if Stephen asked this, and I apologize if I'm asking it again. Mm-hmm. How did you come out the other side thinking about your own personal battles with fear and moving forward now? Because you say like, and it was great what you just said about fear opening doors. Mm-hmm. And obviously writing this book, it's a tall order. I can't imagine the amount of research, because I feel like every other sentence you have a quote, or you read through something and I'm like, man, this is it. And it's, to me, that's incredible to be able to put all of those things on a page or pages and make it flow as well as it has. Like I said, did fear change for you? Was it more of the open door type, or was there still some of that contraction? And it's okay, obviously, if it's both.
To some degree, there is both. I think at the end of the book, I started thinking less about feeling sort of neurotically obsessed with my own physical safety and more really thinking about the connection between feeling really worried about creatures around me and sort of like feeling more like a caretaker than like Little Red Riding Hood. Like I felt more like the person who shoved her out the door. And I think part of this was thinking about like the effects of climate change more broadly was like a big sense of anxiety that like I couldn't pin down. You know, that's like the anti-wolf. If the wolf is the easy thing to blame fear on for so long. I mean, there were these historians in Scandinavia saying like we put the whole fear of death into the wolf hunt because at those times you had plagues, you had all of this. I mean, stuff was bad in these Middle Ages, and like we'll call it the wolf, and everyone will fight the wolf, and they'll feel better if they're fighting the wolf. Like there's something in that. And right now, I'm not comfortable. What is it? You know, things are bad. We've got a pandemic. We've got wildfires. We've got all this stuff. And how do you live beside that uncertainty if there's not an easy scapegoat, right? And scapegoat is actually like its own interesting animal thing to say that's different than the wolf, but I think part of the project was just like learning to live beside the uncertainty. And maybe this is like the project for all of us with mortality. I think so much that like growing up is just like learning to live beside the things that make us afraid and learning how to kind of understand what we can't control. I think I went into this, there's a French phrase, entre chien et loup, that I kind of come back to multiple times, probably totally botching the pronunciation, but the idea that at a certain hour of dusk, you can't tell if the figure before you is a dog or a wolf. And I thought, I'm interested in this moment where we evaluate the rationale of our fears. And I felt like at a time, especially after I'd had a couple like assaults on the street where I was unable to know how to walk down the street. I felt like I couldn't tell what was a dog, what was a wolf, if I was right to be afraid. And, you know, now I think I do, I've learned to trust my gut a little bit more. And also just to understand that like sometimes we can't tell. And actually we just have to like go through the world not knowing, is this thing going to lead to a pandemic? I don't know. You go through your days until suddenly it's there. And like, I think in ultimately drafting the book during the pandemic was kind of informative because the whole world had gotten scarier than I could have imagined it could have. And like living with that as the baseline was like, well, what else is there? There's still all this beauty, even when you're afraid, like there's something else there. And so that felt kind of hopeful.
And I want to ask you this too, because you put, like you said that French phrase, and what was your favorite? My favorite might not be the right word. What was the thing? Either it's a statement or a book or a lore that stuck with you the most out of all the research that you've done, and you did a lot of it because you, like you said, Norse mythology and colonialism and things like that. What was the thing that really stuck with you, or a saying that stuck with you that is going to be one of those things you carry now that the book is through, and maybe it's a guiding force for life or moving forward, or what's going to stick with you after the project?
I love that. I'm looking at a couple I've written down some of the idioms at one point. I got really interested in these sort of like idioms that are around the world. Very often parents maybe told stories about the wolf to sort of teach their young how to be brave or how to stay alive. And I originally thought maybe I'd structure the chapters around different idioms. And there's one that's Romanian that is, the wolf gets the blame and the fox gets the grain. And there's something very simplistic and sort of childlike about these, of course, but I also think there's often like a lesson, like the thing that we're saying is the problem. Is that really a problem, or is that the distraction from the other problem, right? And I think very often the wolf has been unfairly made into the threat when, to go back to like rancher issues, there's a sense that like, if we just got rid of the wolves, my life would be a lot easier. And I was talking to a couple, people in that area saying, actually, like, here's these things that make livestock production really hard right now. And it's not the wolf, right? And that idea, I think, of being able to like isolate the thing that feels like the bad thing and then say like, okay, put that aside. What else is going on? Feels like a really good reflex or kind of impulse. And I also am thinking, secondly, of a story that came out of northeastern Japan that really stuck with me in the late 18th century. There was like a village where people would thank the wolf because the wolf would scare away their deer from their fields. And that sense, in that context, the wolf was kind of a shepherd and a protector of the landscape. And I just think like understanding that we don't exist as kind of like, this is the predator, this is the prey, this is the clearness. Like actually, so much of that depends on the social cultural systems we're in. And those things can change. And like, can we see each other in ways that maybe we exist? I write at the end of the book, like we don't exist in a boxing ring with wolves. We're kind of like all on a dance floor and we're moving around in and out of each other's shadows. And like, there's something more generative about that. So I've tried to sort of, it's really increased my views of sort of like ecological complexity in a way that feels really fruitful.
Man, no, that's really a great way to put it. I want to talk just briefly about the audiobook portion of it. What was it for you? Because you're talking about your work so eloquently and going through it because you know it. What was it like for someone else to read this? And I'm listening to obviously the audiobook at the moment. And how was that for you to hear someone else share your story, your words, things like that? And Lessa Lamb, I think is how I pronounce her name, the narration style. How did that go over for you when you ultimately heard it fully read?
It's so surreal. I've never had that experience. And we got some editions of the different people reading the book that they sort of said, help us weigh in. And I was immediately drawn to Lessa's voice, which I think had some of the same enthusiasm as mine. You know, part of it, like a project this big, clearly it's because I'm a little obsessed with wolves and the stories we tell about them. And I wanted the reader to kind of understand that and also understand that, I guess both things. I feel like she really brings both the seriousness that I felt like this topic has, but people sometimes think like, oh, you wrote this whole book about like fear and wolves being dragged into human problems. Like this is like a real downer. And I was like, I think there's a lot of joy and humor and sort of these little moments where there's like absurdity that I'm trying to point out. And I feel like she kind of nailed that texture. So I was really pleased with that. I also think hearing my own story, you have a lot of distance from it. And there's something sort of surreal. There would be moments where I would think, well, I can't write about this scene because, you know, when you're first drafting it, you're like, what does the reader care about? And it's kind of easy when you're writing scenes about yourself to say, nobody else is going to care about this. I shouldn't put it in. But it's funny because now I sort of had to silence that internal critic. And now hearing it through her voice, I think like, oh yeah, I'm actually listening along. Like this tells me something about something else. And I guess there's a little confidence boost in like relating to myself, almost not as myself, but as someone else. And I can have a little more empathy for maybe this younger 18-year-old version of myself than I do internally where I'm hard on her.
That's interesting. I always wonder about that too, what authors think who don't read their own book and like it's just always interesting to me. You would think that the author would want to read, but I've noticed that in some of the audiobooks that I've actually listened to and I go, oh, that's not the author. They find someone else. And that's a good point to make, that you find someone that really channels you throughout the words. Did you find there was any chapter that, because you said some of the stories, she inflects on certain things and does certain voices there, and it does bring to life the story a little bit more. Was there anything that stood out in a certain chapter that you felt, this is awesome on audio? This is the, like, you know, go to chapter whatever or paragraph whatever, and it sort of stood out.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the reasons why I wanted to have a professional read it was that I felt like going between the personal stories and the history, I wasn't sure how I would do that. I felt like, is this going to feel natural or flowy? And I think one of the things that she does really interesting, and I really noticed it actually in this last chapter, which in some sections is more personal to my family, in this mother versus wolf chapter. And there'll just be like, she'll be talking about, you know, like the death by suicide of a close family member. It's an intense experience. And then there's not a bunch of pause. She'll kind of go into the wolf stuff, for example. And I think that's really beautiful. And I think I would have maybe imagined like, how do these things, they're sort of like separate fragments. And there's something about the way she reads it that really makes me feel the weave of it. And so I guess that chapter I was just particularly sensitive about because there's some more family stuff in it. But there's also amazing research that I love. We're in India, we're in Azerbaijan, thinking about wolf stories, and the way she's sort of able to make it feel resonant is sort of my biggest dream for like a chapter like that, where I'm like, is the reader going to be with me if I'm taking them to all these places? I'm checking wolf tracks with the biologist. I'm talking about my family. I'm dealing with a girl raised by wolves in Azerbaijan, and she suddenly is able. There's something about the way she reads it where I didn't feel the whiplash that I sort of imagined I might.
How about the title and the cover? Can you tell us about those elements and how they came to be?
Yeah, I originally we had a different title, which was just Cry Wolf, and we were almost imagining like a comma after cry, or maybe a silent comma. And there's a thriller with that title. And so I got an email from the publicist one day that was like, you've been scooped. There's a thriller and it's doing really well. And so we got to change it. And I think Wolfish, I liked it ultimately because it is a title that implies people projecting a wolf onto something else, right? If you say, oh, my dog is wolfish, that person's wolfish. And it's very much about the like human projection. And I felt like I wanted to separate the wolf from the ish that we make it into, and I was kind of interested in that tension. And similarly, the cover in the US is this beautiful, like hands creating a shadow wolf on the wall. And I liked that idea that I wanted people to be really aware that the wolf, when your average American says wolf, they're conjuring something that is a creation very often of rhetoric, and like there's a shadow there. And so I wanted to sort of separate the shadow from the real wolf. And so I was really pleased with how Macmillan did all of this, treating it. And I also think the word wolfish kind of implies like an omnivorousness. And I do feel like researching this book I was kind of wolfish. Like I was very hungry and roaming all around. And someone described my narration as like a wolf, just like wandering in all these different categories. And I sort of like that idea, which made title too.
Yeah.
Is there a reason for the graphic style decision of the wolf? I'm just curious because it seems very specific, but it could just be a graphic decision that was made on the fly. But I'm just curious if there's a reason for that.
A friend of mine had found like an old Victorian shadow puppet of a wolf, and that was the sort of image that we sent, and they kind of let the author weigh in. And I was like, this is so interesting. And then they kind of modernized it in that way. And we liked that even the title of Wolfish is almost like this kind of caution tape font, I think, or it's this really big block letters that do make you sort of self-aware in an almost cartoony way. It's definitely not cartoonish, but there's something very bold and poster-like about it that felt kind of artful. I think there is a real art to how the wolf has been created, or that artifice, right? And I was kind of interested in maybe something that was less realistic to really make clear that this is a human creation.
Yeah.
That's cool.
No, I dig it too. That's a good point, Stephen. And you're right, Eric. I mean, it really does stand out because it's, like you say, that caution tape, that's actually a good correlation because it's that orange and it really just sort of blasts out there. Mm-hmm. And I have to agree to just the way that the cover was put together with the tagline, because usually with long taglines, you never know how it's going to see, because a lot of times you see books, mostly political books, where it's the title's nice and then the tagline it goes on forever and you're like, I'm reading a paragraph before I get in.
Totally.
But it really that just putting it in that circle and making it just right to the right of that, and the wolf sort of guides you to that, which I think is, well, again, whether that was a decision that was, like you said, graphically made, or just it just sort of happened that way, it really just seemed to flow extremely well in that way.
Yeah,
so,
that was cool.
They did a beautiful job. And I think, as you say, like, this is a hard book to describe, and I hope that people will think about, maybe some people are coming to the book because they know they love wolves and want to learn more about them. But also I kind of wanted people who maybe haven't thought much about wolves or read much wolf books, but are like, oh, I'm kind of have this question with anxiety in my life, and like come to it that way. So we were thinking with the subtitle, like, how can we sort of allude that like there's room for everybody here, hopefully.
No, I love it. And I'm like I said, I'm looking forward to finishing it and really getting the full grasp of it and everything that you've put together. My final question for you, I don't know if Steve has anything after me, but is, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
I asked this question of people in the audience the other day, and I put them on the spot. So now it's hard to be, now I'm the one on the spot. I mean, I guess the first thing that did come to mind was what I thought was my first wolf sighting, which was in Yellowstone years ago when we saw a mother buffalo and her baby was sick and she had to abandon the baby, or it was dead. We couldn't quite tell. And the whole herd left it and the baby was there. And in my mind, I then remembered a herd of wolves coming to get the baby. And only later, thinking about the memory and interviewing essentially the other people that were there, I realized I created those wolves. Like probably that we'd said, what's going to happen to this baby? Oh, well, the wolves will come. But it's like, this is life, baby. And I had created the wolves. And later that was so shocking to me because the first draft of this book, I had written that scene with an actual wolf pack. And so I think in my mind, I thought this is this most elemental moment where I'm watching wolves. And later, I just realized there's no way I saw a wolf pack eat a baby. I just imagined that. So it became an example of, I guess, rooted in the real ecology of wolves, but also my projections were pretty strong. And I felt like, ooh, got to check those.
I mean, Erica, this is, I can't recommend the book enough, even though I haven't finished it, but this conversation's been truly incredible. You've done an amazing amount of work, and it really shows in the way that the book flows. And I can't say that enough as someone who likes to read and really bounce back and forth on this wolf topic. So kudos to you for putting this together, for Macmillan for doing the work and getting this book out there. I think it's a valuable resource for people, not only for history, myth, legend, but also I think personally for people who, like you say, who battle maybe their fears personally, professionally, whatever it may be, and looking at how we can correlate this to looking at wolves in the wild and wolves in our lives and how it's going to go. I see nothing but great things for this. So it's available obviously on audiobook. You can buy it. Is it out at regular bookstores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, things like that? Where can everybody can get it that way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So everybody, if you see it again, the title is Wolfish, Wolf Self, and the Stories We Tell About Fear. Erica Berry, thank you so much. Good luck on the rest of the tour. Try and be focused as best you can. I know you're going back and forth, and just stick around for a moment when Steve and I wrap up. But thank you for sharing this, and
thank you
again. Best of luck for the book as it continues to get out to the public.
Thanks so much, John and Stephen. And again, the work that you all are doing, I think does tie so much to these ideas that human psychology and the natural world are really connected. And we just have to look at them in that sort of way, understand the understanding one. You should understand the other, there's this really mutual relationship. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to hear about it through your eyes.
Yeah, this has been great. How's to all you out there, and we'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.